Copics. They're expensive, and we love them, and for good reason. They're considered to be the top of the line when it comes to quality products, but there's other brands out there that compete really well with Copic markers. So I took it upon myself to go to Ross, and I found a set of really cheap, really discounted, off-brand markers that could be a good alternative to Copics. So how well do these off-brands perform compared to professional grade markers? Right off the bat, my impression of them was really good when I brought them home. I liked the packaging. I decided to go online and do a little research to see if I could find any other information about them, but I came up with nothing. The palette variety is broad with a nice range of colors, and I really like those fold-out lay-flat design the packaging has.
Dude, nice.
Like Copics, these markers are made with alcohol-based inks, and they come with two tips. One side is a chisel tip, which is pretty standard. It allows for coverage of large areas on the paper, and you can find it in most brands. But the other side, instead of having a bullet tip, which is pretty usual for these types of off-brand markers, I found that it had a brush nib. That was a pleasant surprise. So it's earning major points on that end.
Swatch it out.
The first thing I like to do when I'm testing out a new art supply is make swatches. I do this because I don't want to run across any surprises, and I want to see how it reacts to the paper. I'm going to be using one of my old marker paper sketchbooks, which, coincidentally, I also got at Ross a while ago for about $4.99. It has a really smooth finish, but the paper is a little thin, and it has no special coating, so I can expect some bleed through, which is pretty normal for this type of paper. Swatching also allows me to make sure that the color of the ink matches the color on the lids, and it also lets me see if there's any weird halo effects or spreading that I should be aware of when I'm using these. So for $12.99, you get $13, you get 36 markers, and I did the math, and that works out to be about 33 cents per marker, which compared to Copic's $6 to $8 marker range, well, I'm sure you can see the appeal. You really can't get a better deal. All in all, I was happy with the color range. It's good. The tips were firm enough to be workable, yet had flexibility comparable to any Copic marker. And the ink did display a little bit of haloing effect, but it laid down a nice flat surface layer. I think my biggest strife with these markers, though, has to be the fact that the color of the inks doesn't perfectly match the color on the caps. This can be a problem, especially if you're just grabbing a color first glance and laying it down, and then once you're using it, you realize that the color that you thought you were using is a little bit off. Not a huge deal really, but that's what swatching's for. It's especially noticeable with two of the colors. Most of them matched up pretty well, but color 188 named Bordeaux, which is presented to be a deep wine red, turned out to be way more desaturated and browner on paper. You can really see it here in the sunlight. And the other color with obvious color matching issues was number 377 olive green. As you can see here, on the cap it looks to be a fresh bright green, but in reality the ink is closer to its name, olive green. So I guess that works out for them, but if you're just basing yourself, again, on just first glance and grabbing the first color you think, you are going to be surprised. The variety of colors is balanced enough where you have a good range of both cool and warm tones. There's not a lot of pastel colors, which is kind of a bummer because those tend to be the colors I use the most in my work. The reason being because you can build them up and layer them more easily, but there's ways around that. And setting them side by side to Copic markers, there's of course the obvious cosmetic differences. For example, barrel shape and color. The chisel nib on the off-brand markers looks to be more compact, but the angle that they're cut in is exactly the same. As for the brush tips, shape-wise they're very similar. I was actually impressed with the brush tip quality of the off-brand markers. In this case, I think I got lucky. It can really vary so much from brand to brand. The brush tip is a little firmer on the Creative Expert marker than the Copic, but that's a plus in my book. Also, to my pleasant surprise, they blend together really well. So you can use both brands together on the same piece, potentially, and it wouldn't really affect the outcome. But the best way to put an art supply to the test is to use it to draw. I started out by sketching out my main idea, and then selecting a limited color palette that I thought would look good. I was excited to use some colors included in the set which looked to be either fluorescent or neon, as well as some pastel tones. I always like matching up my neons with neutral colors and then adding black because it makes them pop. Like, I understand why Copic markers are so desirable, but their price tag of $6 to $8 per marker makes them not so accessible to many other types of artists, like beginners or hobbyists. Not everyone is a professional illustrator. And even as a professional, trying to afford all these high-grade materials can be very limiting, especially if you're producing large volumes of work constantly. You can't really afford to spend all your income on markers. I also don't want beginner artists or young artists to feel like they need to be able to have the best materials to be able to create good art. Those two things don't necessarily correlate. And when it comes to material quality, all alcohol-based markers, yeah, even Copics, are non-archival and non-light fast. What that means is that over time they tend to fade. Exposure to UV light, such as sunlight, will break down the dye in the ink because they're dye-based and not pigment-based. So if you're going to be working with alcohol-based markers with the purpose of practice or with the intention to later digitalize your work, to share on social media or make prints, etc., then there's no real reason to spend possibly hundreds of dollars on the most expensive brand names when the cheaper alternative can achieve the same results. Ultimately, what it really boils down to is the individual artist's skill level and their comfort level with their medium of choice. And the only way to get there is to practice a lot, which means you're going to be using a ton of materials. Do you see where I'm going with this? Why spend exorbitant amounts of money on these expensive markers when you can just buy the off-brands or the knockoffs or whatever you want to call them, and they get the job done? I truly believe that Copic markers, as awesome as they are mostly a fad and they're a little bit overhyped. Yes, they're the best ones quality-wise out there, but don't you think that because you can't afford them, you can't draw. That's just not true. And this is coming from someone who used to collect them religiously. Like in my college years, I used to save up some money and go down to the art store once a week and buy 1 or 2 markers every week. For years. For like 4 years I was doing that. And you know what ended up happening? They cost me so much money and it took so much work to get them that I was too afraid to use them. So most of the time, they would just end up sitting in a drawer, unused. Over here, I started lining the drawing with some Micron pens. They're from Arteza brand, and they function really well. So if you're interested in purchasing a set, I'll leave a link in my description with my affiliate link, which will give you a nice discount. You probably notice how after sketching out my drawing, I erase it, and then I color in, and then I do the line art as the last step. It's a little bit of an unorthodox method of working, but I've just found that this is a technique that works best for me, personally. Laying down colors first is a little bit more forgiving, especially if you're error prone like I am, and it helps avoid the line art from smudging. I then went through the whole thing with a light blue pen to create a shading effect. Then going back to my fine liners to define more details, like folds in the clothing, etc. Details are usually my favorite part of the process, and I tend to go in the zone and just spend hours doing it. Here you can see me bring out my full set of fine liners and pick some larger nibs to bolden some areas of the drawing. Once the main drawing was finished, I started to fill up the whole page with doodles to make it feel more complete. I like to go back and forth between details and larger elements in a process that I like to call weaving. It makes the drawing look more cohesive and brings the whole piece together. I then use an acrylic-based paint marker for the mesh top and for some highlights. Going over the same areas again with ink allows me to build up the whole piece and create more depth. Speeding up the video this much makes it hard to appreciate how long it really took. It's a tedious process, but the end results are well worth it. At the end, for the white highlights, I brought out one of my favorite art materials, the Uniball Signo white pen. No other white ink pen that I've tried so far can compare to this one. Again, I'm going to leave links to all the materials used in this video in the description down below. I then scribbled around the entire page to make the character in the foreground feel more tied in with the background. This is one of my best tips to make a sketchbook page look complete and fully finished. And this is how it turned out. Honestly, not bad for 30-cent markers. So while I run some pretty footage of the finished piece, we can discuss some pros and cons of these markers. For one, their low price tag means that they're much more accessible to everyone. It makes them good for practice and you won't feel so bad about quote-unquote using them up. It has a nice color range and this particular set has brush tips, which is a huge plus. This makes them versatile and blendable and able to do all the cool things Copic markers can do too. These also happen to have a cool carrying case, which makes them portable. They can be your backpack set. As for the cons, the barrel design is too round compared to Copics, so they tend to roll off the table. And the ink inside the marker doesn't accurately match the color of the caps. They're also non-refillable as most non-Copic markers are, which means you're going to have to replace them more often. They're also non-archival, but as we've established before, no alcohol-based markers are. So I guess that doesn't really matter. All in all, I would give them 3 out of 5 stars. I think that's fair. They're pretty alright, but I also wouldn't give Copic markers 5 out of 5 stars just because of their price. So yeah, I encourage you to try them. Go out there and find some supplies that will encourage you to create more. I hope this video inspires you to bring your sketchbook out and play around that old set of markers you had laying around. And if you found this video helpful at all and you want to see what else I've been creating, take a moment to subscribe to my channel. As for my next video, I'm going to be comparing 3 sets of markers in pastel tones of 3 different price ranges to see how they hold up against each other. I hope to see you next time, and thanks for watching.